The heavy iron-bound volume lay open on the worn oak table, its pages brittle with age, the ink faded to sepia. Jacques Dubois, a prosperous merchant of wines and silks, did not recognize the elegant hand that had inscribed his grandfather's name, Jean-Baptiste Dubois, across the top of a sheet, followed by a meticulous, almost artistic flourish. Below it, in a different, more hurried script, was a single chilling sentence. Insubordonné et médisant à l'égard des autorités royales, s'est permis des propos séditieux en l'an de grâce 1733 à Angers. Insubordinate and slanderous towards royal authorities, permitted himself seditious remarks in the year of grace 1733 in Angers. 87 years later, this brief damning entry, unearthed by a diligent functionary of the newly established Ministry of Police, threatened to unravel Jacques' carefully built world, casting a shadow of ancestral treason over his own burgeoning ambitions. What power could a few lines of forgotten script, penned in a bygone age against a man long dead and buried, still wield over the living? The France of the Ancien Régime, particularly in the century leading up to its violent undoing, was a realm where the king's will was absolute, and his gaze, however distant, was perceived as omnipresent. To maintain this colossal apparatus of power, the monarchy developed an intricate, if sometimes haphazard, system of surveillance and information gathering. It was a vast, sprawling network, less a perfectly oiled machine, and more a collection of overlapping, often competing, eyes and ears, all feeding into the central authority. The primary instrument of this control in the capital was the Lieutenant General de Police, a figure of immense power, wielding authority over not merely crime and public order, but also the very thoughts and sentiments of Parisians. Names like La Reynie, d'Argenson, and especially Sartine and Lenoir became synonymous with the omnipresent eye of the state, their offices accumulating mountains of paper, each sheet a potential thread in a man's undoing. These vast archives were not merely a repository of criminal records, they were a living history of public opinion, private grievances, and the perceived loyalties or disloyalties of subjects. The collection of intelligence began subtly, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Parish priests, obligated to report on the moral conduct of their flock, often included political observations in their confidential communications to the authorities. Guildmasters, city officials, and even intendants, the king's regional representatives, were expected to submit regular reports on the mood of their districts, detailing any murmurs of discontent, unusual gatherings, or the spread of inflammatory pamphlets. Beyond these formal channels, a more shadowy and extensive network thrived. The mouches, or flies, as the police informers were colloquially known. These individuals were drawn from all strata of society, from disgruntled servants and jealous neighbors to tavern keepers and hack writers, all incentivized by small payments, protection from minor infractions, or the simple desire for influence. They would loiter in cafes, listen in barbershops, and frequent the salons of the Parisian elite, their ears perpetually tuned for seditious talk, scandalous rumors about the royal family, or any sentiment that might challenge the established order. Each snippet, however trivial, was deemed potentially significant. A careless word over a glass of wine, a satirical verse whispered in a theater, a critical comment on the king's latest decree, all could find their way onto a police report. Consider the humid summer evening in the year 1774. The air in the Café Procope, usually thick with the animated debate of philosophes and wits, hung heavy and oppressive. Antoine, a gaunt, unassuming man with eyes that darted perpetually, nursed a single glass of weak wine. His gaze was fixed on a small group at a nearby table, their voices low, their gestures animated. One man, a minor playwright known for his sharp tongue, leaned forward, his face flushed. "They say the king's new mistress, Madame du Barry, cost the treasury more than an entire regiment," he exclaimed, his voice rising slightly above the general din. "And the queen, Austrian though she is, cares only for her fashions and her play acting." Antoine's hand, hidden beneath the table, moved almost imperceptibly, his stubby pencil scratching rapidly on a small folded piece of paper. He captured not just the words, but the speaker's name, the time, the location, and a brief description of the company present. This scrap, no larger than a playing card, would be slipped into a designated drop box later that night, then collected by a police agent, transcribed, and eventually added to a growing file labeled Agitations Publiques, or perhaps directly to a personal dossier should the playwright already be a person of interest. The very act of collecting and collating these fragments transformed mere gossip into evidence, whispers into documented facts. These reports, often based on hearsay, personal animosity, or even simple misunderstanding, were meticulously copied and filed, sometimes in bound registers, sometimes in loose bundles tied with ribbon. The sheer volume was staggering. The Cabinet Noir, a specialized postal censorship office, secretly intercepted and opened private letters, copying excerpts or entire missives deemed politically sensitive. This clandestine operation provided invaluable insights into private lives and political machinations, but also created an enormous additional stream of documentation. A single individual could accumulate multiple entries across various files. A report from his parish priest about his irregular church attendance, a complaint from a neighbor about a noisy evening, an intercepted letter to a relative containing veiled criticisms of the court, and an informer's note about a conversation in a cafe. These disparate pieces, often incomplete and rarely corroborated, coalesced into a dossier, a cumulative record that defined an individual in the eyes of the state. The most potent and feared manifestation of this dossier-driven power was the lettre de cachet. This was a sealed letter bearing the king's personal seal, which contained an order for imprisonment or exile without trial. It was a direct bypass of the conventional judicial system, an instrument of absolute royal authority. Though often associated with state repression, research reveals a more complex picture. While certainly used by the Crown to silence political dissidents or inconvenient critics, a significant number, by some estimates more than half, were issued at the request of families seeking to discipline or control problematic relatives. A profligate son, a rebellious daughter, a spouse deemed mentally unstable, or an uncle whose gambling debts threatened family honor could all be subjected to a lettre de cachet, based on a dossier meticulously compiled by the family's petition, often supported by additional police reports. The reasons were varied: maintaining family reputation, preventing financial ruin, or even enforcing moral standards. The consequence, however, was uniform: immediate, indefinite detention, often in institutions like the Bastille, the fortress of Vincennes, or one of the many provincial state prisons. Imagine the year 1785. Madame de Valois, her face a mask of cold determination, sat across from an official in the Lieutenant General de Police's office. Her petition, thick with carefully chosen words, detailed her 23-year-old nephew's escalating debts, his dissolute companions, and his repeated public scandals. "He disgraces our name, monsieur," she stated, her voice trembling with feigned distress. "He will bring ruin upon us all." The official listened, nodding occasionally, his eyes scanning the accompanying reports. Notes from 2 different informers detailing the young man's visits to gambling dens, a priest's lament about his missed confessions, and a tailor's unpaid bill. All these separate threads, woven into a single narrative of debauchery and insubordination, formed the core of a nascent dossier. Within weeks, a lettre de cachet was prepared, signed by the king. One damp evening, the young Valois, returning from a late-night carouse, was seized by 2 plainclothes officers, bundled into a carriage, and spirited away to the fortress of Vincennes, his fate sealed by the words on those collected papers. He would remain there for years, his family content that their honor and their inheritance was now secured. His file, however, would remain open, accumulating notes on his conduct within the prison walls, a testament to his continued existence within the state's memory, even as he languished forgotten by much of the outside world. The consequences of this system for individuals were profound and often devastating. It fostered a pervasive climate of fear and suspicion. One never knew who might be listening, or what seemingly innocent comment might find its way into a dossier. Public life was circumscribed, private conversations guarded. The arbitrary nature of the lettre de cachet meant that reputation alone, or the enmity of a powerful individual, could lead to indefinite imprisonment without recourse. For those thus confined, the psychological toll was immense. They were cut off from family, livelihood, and the outside world, their existence reduced to an entry in a ledger. Even for those who escaped direct action, the knowledge that their lives were potentially under scrutiny, their words recorded, had a chilling effect on speech and thought. Historians, however, offer varied perspectives on the true extent and effectiveness of this surveillance. Some, like Michel Foucault, emphasize the pervasive nature of disciplinary power, arguing that the Ancien Régime represented an early form of a carceral society, where power was exercised through observation and documentation, shaping individual behavior. Others, such as Alet Farge, while acknowledging the intrusive nature of police powers, also highlight the often haphazard and fragmented nature of the system, pointing out that police reports were frequently contradictory, biased, and influenced by personal vendettas or simple errors. The sheer volume of information could also lead to inefficiency and bureaucratic inertia. Was it a finely tuned instrument of absolute control, or a messy human enterprise prone to error and personal agendas, yet terrifyingly effective when wielded against an individual? Both interpretations hold merit, suggesting a system that was simultaneously formidable in its reach and deeply flawed in its execution. A potent symbol of arbitrary power that could, at any moment, pluck an ordinary subject from their life and consign them to oblivion, all based on the silent testimony of a few accumulated papers. And yet, these dossiers, these collections of whispers and accusations, did not simply disappear with the individuals they condemned. They persisted, silent witnesses to lives disrupted, even ended. As the Ancien Régime teetered on the brink of collapse, its sprawling archives, filled with the meticulously recorded failings and transgressions of thousands, remained. What would become of these potent instruments of control when the very system they served was swept away by a tide of revolutionary fervor? Would the files be purged, their contents dismissed as relics of tyranny, or would they, like dormant seeds, find new soil in the fertile ground of a new, even more demanding regime? The answer would be etched in the very streets of Paris, in the shadow of the guillotine, and within the new, chillingly efficient bureau of the First Republic. The storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, was more than a symbolic act of liberation. It was an assault on the physical embodiment of arbitrary power. Yet, as the stone walls crumbled and the few remaining prisoners were freed, the true legacy of the Ancien Régime's surveillance system did not simply vanish. The dossiers, those meticulously compiled records of suspicion and dissent, were not destroyed en masse. Instead, they underwent a startling transformation, their purpose shifting dramatically, but their fundamental power remaining intact, indeed, even growing. What started as instruments of royal control over a subject population morphed into tools for revolutionary purification, identifying enemies of the people with a chilling precision born from decades of established practice. The very same mechanisms of information gathering that had protected the monarchy were now turned, with brutal efficiency, against anyone deemed a foe of the burgeoning republic. The initial days of the revolution saw a chaotic scramble for records. Some archives were indeed pillaged, their contents scattered or burned in acts of public defiance, particularly those directly associated with aristocratic families or hated institutions. However, many crucial collections, particularly those maintained by the police and the state bureaucracy, were seized intact. Revolutionary officials quickly recognized the immense value of these existing dossiers. They contained a wealth of information, lists of suspected royalists, details of clerical nonconformity, reports on dissenting intellectuals, and even records of private citizens' complaints and grievances against one another. The new regime, deeply paranoid and constantly battling both internal and external threats, understood that knowledge was power, and these old files offered an unparalleled blueprint of French society, identifying individuals who might be exploited, coerced, or, most importantly, purged. The very act of rebellion against state power thus paradoxically absorbed and amplified its most insidious tool. the establishment of the Comité de Surveillance, surveillance committees. Throughout France in 1793 marked a critical turning point. These local bodies, composed of zealous citizens, were tasked with identifying, denouncing, and arresting suspects. The definition of a suspect was deliberately broad, encompassing anyone who, by their conduct, their contacts, their words, or their writings, showed themselves to be partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. This vague criterion meant that a history of a single critical remark, a past association with an émigré, or even a simple lack of enthusiasm for revolutionary ideals could be grounds for denunciation. The old dossiers became foundational texts, serving as starting points for new investigations. An individual identified as insubordinate or seditious in a 1773 report from the Ancien Régime police archives might now find themselves on a revolutionary suspect list, the 77 years that had passed rendered irrelevant by the enduring mark on paper. The file that follows you had indeed found new life. Consider the predicament of Monsieur Dubois, our wine merchant from the beginning, a man now in his 60s. His family had been respectable under the king, then cautiously supportive of the early revolution. But his grandfather's ancient record, unearthed by a zealous local comité de surveillance, combing through newly centralized archives, became a grave liability. The entry, once merely a note of sedition against the crown, was reinterpreted through the lens of revolutionary fervor. Heirs of a known enemy of public order, the comité scribbled on a fresh sheet added to the old file. Bourgeois profiteer, suspiciously reserved about the September massacres. The fact that his grandfather's alleged sedition was against the monarchy, not for it, was lost in the revolutionary zeal, or simply reinterpreted as a general tendency towards disorder. In the eyes of the Republic, any past deviation from the prevailing orthodoxy, regardless of its original target, became a mark of potential disloyalty. His efforts to obtain a certificat de civisme, a crucial document attesting to one's good standing as a citizen, were now hampered by this ancestral stain. The weight of a few forgotten words, penned by a long-dead functionary about a man who had withered into dust, pressed down upon his present, threatening to crush his future. The process of denunciation and arrest during the Reign of Terror, from 1793 to 94, was terrifyingly efficient. Once a suspect was identified, through old dossiers, new denunciations, or the infamous law of suspects, they were brought before a comité de surveillance, or, for more serious cases, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris. Here, the dossier became the centerpiece of their fate. It was not a legal document in the traditional sense, offering evidence for defense, but rather a cumulative record of suspicion. These files contained everything: letters intercepted by the Cabinet Noir, now repurposed by the Revolutionary Police, old police reports, new denunciations from neighbors, extracts from suspect pamphlets found in a home, and even vague character assessments. Defense was often a formality, and the verdict, acquittal or death, was frequently predetermined by the weight of the paper against them. The public spectacle of the trials and the swift journey to the guillotine served as a stark lesson in the power of these records. The revolution, which had promised to erase the arbitrary injustices of the past, had instead forged an even more expansive and brutal bureaucracy of suspicion, using the very archives it inherited. The consequences for society were catastrophic. The Reign of Terror led to tens of thousands of arrests and executions across France. The dossier, once a tool for quiet suppression or family control, became a direct pathway to the scaffold. It created an atmosphere of utter paranoia, where everyone was a potential informer, and every word, every gesture could be misconstrued and added to a file. Families turned on one another. Neighbors denounced neighbors, all driven by fear, ideological zeal, or opportunistic revenge. The very notion of individual privacy evaporated under the relentless gaze of the revolutionary committees. The state now demanded not just obedience, but fervent adherence to its ideals, and the dossiers were the primary means of enforcing this conformity. This period illustrated how easily the instruments of control, once created for one regime, could be adapted and amplified by another. even one born from a promise of liberty. Historians grapple with the complexities of the Terror, particularly regarding the role of centralized power versus local initiatives. Some, like Patrice Guenify, emphasize the Jacobin government's deliberate and systematic use of state terror, with the Committee of Public Safety and its vast network of agents and committees driving the purges, relying heavily on the compiled dossiers for their decisions. Others, such as Colin Lucas, suggest a more chaotic and decentralized picture, where local comités de surveillance, often driven by local feuds and popular passions, operated with significant autonomy, creating their own dossiers and driving the arrests, sometimes even against the wishes of Paris. Both interpretations acknowledge the critical role of documentation and record-keeping, whether centrally directed or locally generated, in identifying and eliminating enemies. The sheer volume of paper, the meticulous lists of suspects, the detailed reports of denunciations, all attest to a bureaucratic fervor that ran parallel to the revolutionary passion, transforming individual lives into mere entries in a vast, terrifying ledger. Even after the Thermidorian reaction ended the reign of terror, and the Directorian Empire followed, these dossiers did not disappear. They continued to be consulted, amended, and adapted, shaping careers, determining reputations, and haunting individuals for decades. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, understood the power of organized information. His own Ministry of Police, under the formidable Joseph Fouché, became an even more sophisticated and expansive surveillance apparatus, incorporating and expanding upon the files inherited from both the Ancien Régime and the Revolution. The concept of the dossier had outlived not just its targets, but the very regimes that created them, demonstrating an enduring, chilling power.